In April 2022, Netflix published its first quarter results and told the market that paid memberships had declined by 200,000 in the quarter that ended March 31. Within hours, the stock price collapsed, and by the next day, it was down about 35%, closing at roughly $226 a share. In one burst of trading, roughly $50 billion in market value vanished. The reaction lamped faster than the details. The era of effortless streaming growth had ended. This is the story of how, for most of the 2010s, Netflix had represented a simple promise. A monthly fee bought an always-on library, minimal friction, and a sense that something new would be waiting on Friday night. The company had trained customers to expect consistent upgrades, better originals, bigger stars, and local language hits that traveled. It had also trained investors to accept losses today for scale tomorrow, because scale had looked inevitable. The business model had felt clean. Netflix sold subscriptions, it retained members by keeping watch time high, and it recycled that predictable cash into content. The bigger the global base became, the more each new show could be amortized. The more the library grew, the less any single cancellation mattered. By the end of 2021, Netflix said it had 221.84 million subscribers worldwide. At that size, a single successful original could drive worldwide conversation and still be economically rational. The platform had become a default choice, not just a service. It had been the reference point that competitors chased. This empire had also benefited from a specific moment in media. Traditional TV had been fragmenting. Studios had been licensing catalogs widely. Consumers had been learning to pay for entertainment as a subscription rather than a channel package. Netflix had arrived early, built distribution, and scaled a recommendation engine that kept people watching. But stability depended on conditions that did not stay stable. When the pandemic surge faded, the growth curve stopped being vertical. Competitors arrived with deep catalogs, familiar franchises, and bundled pricing. Meanwhile, consumer budgets tightened, and streaming went from novelty to line item. In that environment, Netflix's most powerful advantage, its reach, also became a ceiling. High penetration reduced the pool of easy ads. Inside the company, pressure built in the quiet places. The easiest customers had already joined. Marketing could drive awareness, but awareness was no longer the constraint. The constraint was perceived necessity. If Netflix looked like one option among many, then price increases became harder to sustain. If Netflix felt interchangeable, then churn became a monthly habit. Leadership had incentives to move before the narrative hardened. A public company could survive slow growth. It struggled to survive the perception of structural decline, so the company looked for levers that could translate scale into renewed revenue growth. One lever was account sharing. Netflix had long benefited from casual sharing because it spread the habit, but at global scale, the same behavior started to look like leakage. Netflix described account sharing as widespread, estimating that its service was being shared with another 100 million additional households. That number implied hidden demand that could potentially be converted into paying demand. It also implied that reported subscriber counts understated total usage, which made the slowdown harder to diagnose from the outside. Another lever was pricing architecture. If a meaningful portion of the market had become price-sensitive, then a lower-priced tier could defend volume. By April 2022, Netflix executives were openly discussing a lower-priced option supported by advertising. It sounded like a rational adaptation, even if it challenged the brand's long-held identity as a clean, ad-free product. A third pressure sat underneath both. Content had become both the engine and the cost center. Netflix needed enough new releases to reduce cancellations, but it also needed enough efficiency to protect margins. That pushed decision-making towards systems, process, and internal alignment. And in a creative business, alignment always risked becoming ideology in public, even when it was meant to be operations. Then a different kind of lever entered the public story. In May 2022, Netflix updated its corporate culture memo to add an artistic expression section that emphasized the company would not censor specific artists or voices. The same memo warned employees that they might need to work on titles they perceive as harmful, and it suggested the company might not be the right workplace for staff who could not support that breadth. The language was written for internal alignment. Once it became public, it operated as a signal. Internally, the logic was understandable. Netflix produced entertainment across countries, genres, and sensibilities. Any large creative pipeline created inevitable disagreement. Leaders wanted a simple operating rule: ship the slate, let the audience choose, and avoid internal veto points. It was a management tool for velocity. But the public did not read it as a management tool. It was read as a headline. And headlines simplified Netflix into an identity story at the precise moment when the business needed to be read as a product story. That was the attention bet, even if it was not placed intentionally. Netflix had treated attention as an asset for years. Attention drove sampling. Sampling drove retention. Retention justified content spend. In 2022, attention started doing something else. It started reframing what Netflix was, not the utility of the service, but the meaning of the service. A platform that once tried to disappear behind personalization now stood out as an institution with stated principles. In the attention economy, stated principles were rarely evaluated in context. They were clipped, redistributed, and attached to whatever narrative was already forming. The fracture moment did not look like a single boycott or a single controversy. It looked like a subtle mismatch that became legible in public. For a decade, Netflix had been the place where the viewer was in control. The company's own language now put Netflix at the center, deciding what would be made and asking others to adapt. At the same time, the product experience had become noisier. More competitors meant more exclusive must-watch releases elsewhere. More subscriptions meant more cancellations, and algorithmic discovery, once a differentiator, became less magical as each platform copied the pattern. So attention increased while trust weakened. The culture memo pulled Netflix into general news cycles that were not about the quality of the next show. The earnings miss pulled Netflix into financial news cycles that were not about long-term dominance. Two different spotlights hit the same company. Both suggested a brand that had moved from inevitability to argument. The decisive evidence arrived in the numbers. For the first quarter of 2022, Netflix said it had expected to add 2.5 million subscribers, but it instead reported a loss of 200,000. It also told investors it expected to lose another 2 million subscribers in the second quarter. Total paid memberships were reported at about 221.64 million at quarter end. The stock then plunged about 35% the next day, closing around $226. In market cap terms, that move erased roughly $50 billion. Those were demand metrics, not attention metrics. They measured churn, slowdown, and the cost of lost confidence. Attention was abundant, but demand had become conditional. The question became whether it would still be paid for at the same scale. The gut punch was that the miss arrived after years of a single story. Netflix had been priced as a company that turned attention into subscriber growth with automatic reliability. In April 2022, it delivered contraction and guided to more contraction. The market did not just reprice a quarter. It repriced the assumption that the next decade would look like the last one. After the shock, Netflix's public posture stayed controlled. Executives framed the reversal as a mix of competition, account sharing, and a tougher economy. The company continued to emphasize programming investment, and executives said they still planned to spend around $18 billion on content in 2022. Privately, the playbook shifted from expansion to extraction. The next steps were incremental, but they pointed in a new direction. Netflix moved toward paid sharing rules. It accelerated work on an ad-supported tier. It trimmed parts of the organization and became more selective about projects. The message in markets was that Netflix would prioritize profitability and cash discipline, not just growth. By July 2022, Netflix reported it had lost 970,000 subscribers in the second quarter, below its earlier forecast of a 2 million loss. That update eased the immediate panic, but it did not restore inevitability. The narrative had already changed. Netflix was no longer evaluated as a pure growth machine. It was evaluated like a mature media company, with all the vulnerabilities that label carried. 3 mistakes defined the slide. The first mistake was a misread of the customer relationship. Netflix had assumed its strongest relationship was habit, built by convenience and volume. In reality, the relationship had been partly emotional trust, the belief that Netflix's next recommendation would justify the fee. Once growth stalled, customers became more willing to treat Netflix as optional because the habit was shared across multiple services. The second mistake was a mismatch in what the category meant. Streaming had started as utility, unlimited access on demand. By 2022, it also functioned as identity. Which shows mattered, which platform was the home of cultural moments. The Culture Memo's public life blurred Netflix's product value with its internal posture, and it made the platform feel like a statement rather than a neutral utility. The third mistake was timing and credibility. Netflix reached for monetization levers, paid sharing, and advertising right after telling the market that growth had reversed. Those moves could have been framed as deliberate evolution. Instead, they looked like emergency adaptations introduced after the bridge of confidence had already burned. In the end, Netflix did not collapse. It kept a vast subscriber base and continued to release hits, but the company entered a new phase where every decision carried a different weight because the old guarantee was gone. Attention still arrived, but attention no longer automatically converted into more paying months. Someone still had to renew the subscription.